Hello and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And as usual, I'm here with my friends and colleagues.
Red Keating.
And David Kennedy.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today we're very lucky to have a guest with us. We heard about his book and we heard him on CBC, and we were so looking forward to and so appreciative when he agreed to do this interview. And that is Dr. Blair Bigham. And so I'd like to just formally introduce Blair, and then we'll jump into our conversation today. So Blair is an award-winning journalist, scientist, and physician who trained in emergency and critical care medicine at McMaster and Stanford universities. He was a global journalism fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs, an associate scientist at St. Michael's Hospital. He is co-host of the CMAJ podcast and deputy editor at healthydebate.ca. Busy guy. He witnesses the relationship between wealth and health on a daily basis and reports on the undertold stories of patients, healthcare providers, and the systems that help or fail them. His first book, Death Interrupted: How Modern Medicine is Complicating the Way We Die, was released September 20th, 2022, and became a national bestseller. Thank you, Blair, and welcome.
Thank
you. I'm so excited to be here.
And after hearing that, I was going to ask sort of the opening question, and I've changed it. I said, "Why such a slacker?"
There's a lot of work to be done to improve our systems out there.
And I think that we can start off by saying that we all really enjoyed the book, really thought-provoking, and it led us to reach out to you. So thank you for the book. It's a good read, and I would say people should pick it up. I guess we were starting off with, what was the driving force? What was the motivation that said, I need to write this book?
Yeah, so I had been obviously working in a space where people die more often than I'd like as a paramedic and emergency physician for quite some time. And one of my mentors invited me to a very interesting court case where a family was suing a hospital of a brain dead woman because they didn't believe she was brain dead. And so this obviously brings up a whole bunch of questions. And I was sitting in the courtroom observing these arguments going back and forth with a judge in the middle. And all the doctors were on one side of the room and all the patient's family members were on the other side of the room. And it just felt so awful. It felt dirty and wrong. And I knew right then and there that the courtroom is no place for these types of conversations to happen. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to report on that story as a journalist for a couple of different outlets, one of which was The Walrus, where I wrote a fairly lengthy essay on sort of this modern phenomena where technology can keep parts of you going, although your outcome is probably not going to be anything meaningful. And a publishing house approached me after that article was published and said, "This seems like a pretty big deal. Would you like to write a book on it?" And, that article had been edited down, I don't know, at least 50%. I had a ton of material and a ton of interviews and said, "Oh, I think this could definitely be expanded upon." And so I jumped at the opportunity and spent the next 2 years writing it.
It was so obvious that that the writing took place over a long period of time, because there's really extensive research, and you reference your the body of research out there, but also your conversations with other colleagues around the world and your work in different parts of the world.
Well, that's the joy of being able to write a book, is that you can contextualize the research, and you can do that through interviewing people who are really ahead of the curve. And so the interviews for me were more informative than all the scientific research out there that's been done on this topic. And being able to express that sort of journey that I had interviewing people in 60,000 words is an experience that I hadn't had before. And it allows you to really tell the story of this modern dilemma in ways that are much harder to tell in shorter versions.
I love the idea, even the title of the book, the idea of interrupting what this concept of death, which is which is a normal process in our human experience. But that becomes the challenge in our society when obviously people don't even see death as the normal ending of life, and so we're constantly trying to fight that and push it off. So I love the title.
The title is important. It really speaks to a very common phrase I hear in the ICU, which is, well, why can't we just wait for nature to take its course and they'll just die anyways? Why do we have to take the machines away? And the answer is that what we have done is we have interrupted nature. And we've all seen people tick along for months without much dignity, with an awful lot of suffering as they're poked and prodded and turned. And we really are interrupting it. And so I try to reframe the conversation with families from, no, this isn't about you guys making a decision. This is about canceling my decision. I made the decision to put them on technology. The technology hasn't worked. It's not going to work. We're not making a new decision here. We're really just canceling a previous decision so that nature or God or whatever belief system people follow, that belief system is able to be valued, and that people are able to follow through on whatever faith or scientific beliefs they've held their whole lives.
I think, sorry, Julie. I think it was on the CBC where you said, it's not me telling you this. It's the body of your loved one. The body is telling us this. The body is telling us that all of our interventions are not working, and it's actually fighting against those interventions. And it's not you, it's not the family. It's actually the individual's body saying, I'm trying to shut down, and you're trying to keep me going. But that's got to be a difficult conversation to have with families.
It is, and it was horrible during the pandemic when families couldn't come in. A lot of the time families will come and visit, and if you create the space, they'll say something along the lines of, they look like they're gone, or they'll express some sort of recognition that the physical body doesn't look right. And often when people are early in their illness, they're robust, right? They have muscle mass, they look okay, their color is good. But as the disease progresses and as our medical interventions fail to achieve what we hope for, we all kind of see it in the body, right? I see it in the temporal area, right? You see that wasting away, that sunkenness in the temples, that type of appearance. When you see someone every day, you can sort of appreciate this gradual wasting away. And sometimes families can see that too. And so often at the bedside, I'll say, what do you see when you see this person in bed? And that type of conversation is difficult, but it often helps people realize that, oh, this isn't the person in photographs. This isn't the person I had lunch with 2 months ago. This isn't the person from last Christmas. This is a body that's failed.
Right. I think we see that a similar conversation in hospice and palliative care when we see families wanting nutrition provided or fluid, and we're saying the body's trying to shut itself down. It doesn't need the same nutritional value. It doesn't need those calories. The body is trying to shut down. It doesn't, your loved one doesn't need to drink anymore. They're not, that's almost counteractive, but a very hard conversation to get through our heads as lay people, that's part of the process.
Food is so ingrained in us as an act of love. Every time I go visit my parents, my mom tries to shove food at me, like, Mom, I don't need you to cook anything for me. I'm just here to visit. But, expressing love through food is very common. Anybody who has grandparents alive, your grandparents are trying to cook you food. They want to teach you about how they cook. Food is so central to taking care of people. When you're a baby, your parents supply you with food. So this idea of withholding food it's more about just the idea of starvation or the idea of being hungry. It really gets down to a very core human quality where food is love. And so when we say we don't need to feed people anymore, I think deep down inside, people feel like that's not loving. And so I think there's a huge barrier when we say, let's stop nutrition.
It's really interesting to me when I just listening there, what triggered is you're right, when people can't see the body and see the wasting physically. But I've often talked to to patients early in their trajectory after they've received that life-threatening diagnosis, and months later, and they still do look good, as you say, early on. They still look, and people will say, "Oh, you look so good," and they react to that. They say, yeah, I may look good, but I'm not good. So they know it before other people know it. And I think that, but often at the very end, they're not able to speak for themselves. So other people are making those decisions. But it's a challenge, you're right, with COVID, where we didn't get a chance to see.
It also gives us the opportunity to realize that there's different approaches here based on who we're talking to. If you're talking to a patient, how do you feel? Are you feeling better? Like, are you feeling stronger? Is this therapy making you miserable? And sometimes people go, we've tried 3 therapies and I feel more and more miserable each time. And that's an opening for us to have a conversation about foregoing further medical interventions. But for families, a lot of they don't necessarily know how they feel. And so it's, well, how do they look? But, I've had some very successful goals of care conversations where I just get the patient, tell your family how you're feeling. And the patient says, this sucks. I'm not happy. And the family sometimes, not always, sometimes has a little bit of a moment there where they hear that and they go, oh. But other times, that family's own desire for that person to go on can be so overwhelmingly strong that they just can't accept what the patient themselves might be saying or showing.
And in your book, Blair, you speak about the moral distress that can create for healthcare providers. And if I could just read a quote from your book.
Sure.
You said, page 186, "Mom would never want this, yet can't bring themselves to let go, to let those wishes be acted upon by the medical team. It's heartbreaking to watch and morally distressing to know you're not in line with someone's expressed wishes." Can you speak about that, the moral distress?
Yeah. So, I think if you want to talk about moral distress, you talk to any bedside nurse who's been in ICU for more than a day, and they have stories of keeping people supported far longer than they personally believe was, I'll use the term ethical. The nurses have very strong opinions about this at the bedside. But for me, it's a huge struggle. I proceeded with tracheostomy recently on a patient where I didn't really know if that's what they wanted, but the family was so clear. The family was very forceful. And I just said, fine, like, we'll do it. And it's very hard for us physicians and healthcare professionals who haven't known this person for very long. And, maybe they've been in hospital for 3 months. There's like 7 goals of care notes. They're all a little bit different. You didn't have any of them. And goals of care can change over time. It's really, really tough to know that you're doing the right thing for the patient. And, even, I have less strongly held opinions around most patients than I used to after having written this book. I believe more in patient and family autonomy than I had prior, but I still have those moments where I'm like, man, everyone's telling me this is what the patient wants, but there's no way that there's no way that the patient wants this. Maybe they said something in the past, but without the context of what's happening now. And, you just sit there and go, there's no way that this patient wants resuscitation. There's no way. But there we are, 9 times out of 10, I'll start resuscitating. And the other time I might call up ethics, and the next thing you know, the family's feeling like you're against them. It's a very uncomfortable place to be when you're trying to tell a family that, look, I think you're expressing your wishes, not their wishes. And that's hard. And some families do not respond well to that. And it can become administrative battles, litigious battles, as soon as there's ethics involved. Although they're very, very helpful in their framing of things, the very notion of having to bring in this outside person to my family relationship can sometimes have a negative effect on that relationship. It's really, really tricky. And I don't have answers to how we make that easier. I don't know. Do you guys have any tips for me?
It's in our next book.
You mean our first book?
Yeah, our first book.
I've got the pages numbered.
And I think you talked about that as an agonizing place to be, in that zone between life and death, and working in that space is agonizing. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't sort of bring up the idea of your concept of the death dilemma. And I'm wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the dilemma is really this idea that we have all of this technology without necessarily the wisdom of knowing when to use it and when not to use it. And nobody wants to withhold technology from someone who could benefit from it. That would be dying too early. And, I've sworn an oath not to let that happen. So I initially am trained and compelled to do everything I can to save someone's life. But that technology doesn't always work. And knowing when you've hit that point is really the thrust of the dilemma. Like, nobody knows for sure when you've hit that point. The nurse might know a couple days before me. Maybe I know a couple days before the nurse. But like, at some point, all of us kind of on the same page that the writing's on the wall, right? This isn't going to work out. We don't necessarily tell the family that at that moment, right? Sometimes it takes us a few days to come to terms with our own failure before communicating that to the family. And then the family has to come to terms with it if they can come to terms with it. And I use a couple of terms in the book around sort of false hope, death denialism, this idea that, well, they don't have to die. There's an alternative to death. And, there's always an alternative to death. I don't know that it's always better than death, but there is an alternative. We talk about a lot of the biases that we have in medicine that sort of create this problem. And then our own hubris and what I term resuscitation glorification, this idea that when I start off meeting someone in the emergency department or the ICU, it's very possible that I oversell my capabilities. And with, ER and Grey's Anatomy and whatever shows they've seen on TV, we know that those shows also glorify resuscitation. And so people are conditioned to think that this technology is going to work and that they're not going to die. And that's not always going to be the case. And that's where this dilemma has come in. I mean, the reason technology is the instigator here is because if we didn't have technology, there'd be no dilemma at all. People would just die. That would be the end of it. And so it's this idea that the technology interrupts a natural process, but we don't quite know when to say, it's interrupted, it's not helpful, it's now only harmful. That's a very difficult moment to pinpoint.
I think the idea, and I, the idea of seeing death as the failure is really a challenge to your profession, because we could argue that the failure to keep somebody alive when it was appropriate you might feel that, but
Sure.
But in reality, death is death is a normal part of our human experience. I think, and coming back to your comment though, technology and the use of technology is often driven more by the courts in terms of did you go far enough, or did you? So again, we move it back into the legal piece when it's really that's not the answering, right? That's
right. It really goes beyond the legal, you're right, into more of a societal. It's not even really political. It's really just sort of the culture of where you live. And I've had the chance of working in multiple countries and multiple places within a country. And if I'm in Northern Ontario, the family is basically, in my experience, going to accept whatever recommendation I make. They're very deferential. They're very respectful of my opinion. And they seem more comfortable with death. When people are critically ill, they say, yeah, she looks really sick. We think she's going to die. And that is not the experience I had when I trained in California, where we didn't even talk about death in people who were on 4 vasopressors and a ventilator and ECMO, because we were just going to keep going, because the family expected us to just keep going until there was cardiovascular collapse while we were pushing epinephrine. And that those are not dichotomies that I would want to say are strictly enforced, but there are certainly cultural variations in different places. We know that the UK has a very different sort of threshold for instituting critical care than the Australians do. The Americans and the Canadians, similar differences. And so when we look around the world, this is done differently by different people in different places. And even within one hospital, different families will have wildly different views. Within one family, we might have wildly different views. And you've all had, the four sisters, all four of whom seem to have their own opinion. And there's going to be a loud one, right? There's always a loud one. And then there's always the quiet one. And the quiet one is always the one who knows exactly what's going on, but can't say it for whatever reason, right? Like, and these are all stereotypes that I'm throwing out there with a little bit of humor, but this is what we see all the time. And this just goes to show that it's such an individualized thing, the way we die, the way we live, that it takes a lot of effort and thought and time to build that relationship with people so that we can help guide them through that horrible process without ever calling it too early. I mean, we don't ever want to do that. But the consequence of not wanting to call it too early is that we call it too late far too often.
Right.
Just thinking about this so deeply, interviewing your colleagues, writing the book, has it changed how you do that, how you enter into those conversations with families now, and how you move into when you're in that gray zone, as you call it, in the death dilemma?
It certainly has, but maybe not in the way you would think. I thought that when I started being an attending here in Canada, my reputation of being the Grim Reaper, which I earned in California, because I would want to have these conversations and no, you can't, this patient's not 30 days past their valve surgery. We can't talk about that yet. I'm like, okay, well, they've stroked their entire brain. What do you mean we can't talk about it? I had to make it to the 30-day KPI. But so I came back to Canada. I thought, I'm gonna help people die. And what I found actually was that I was one of the more aggressive resuscitators in some of the places I was working early on. I found that my colleagues were tempted to palliate earlier than I was ready to. And I think the reason they do that is because palliating early is easier than palliating late, because palliating early comes before the technology is on.
I see.
And so there's nothing to withdraw. You sort of just set the expectation that there's nothing we can do. And I think as an emergency doctor, if I say that, families say, oh, that's too bad. Can you make them comfortable? As an ICU doctor, when I say that, families say, well, what do you mean? They've had 5 days here, like their white count is lower because they all have access to their chart now. Or they say, but you fix their potassium. And I'm like, okay, we're looking at these micro improvements, but we're failing to see the big picture. But what this has done for me is I spend more time early on trying to resuscitate someone because I'm hyper acute of the fear I have of giving up too early. And what that then means is that I have people at the day 5 to 10 mark where I've come to the conclusion now that I've honestly given it a good kick at the can and we're not going to get anywhere. And having written this book, I feel like those conversations I have with families are usually very rewarding. I've built a relationship with them over 5 to 10 days, 20 days, however long I decide they get a good kick at the can before I've realized that the writing's on the wall. And so I think this book has surprised me in that I do more resuscitation early on maybe than others, but has aided me in having those conversations that I think many doctors and nurses hope to avoid in the first place, when it does come time to say, we need to go ahead and turn off the machines.
You've hit on some key themes there that in reading the book, I always kept coming back to: time, relationship, and trust. You were asking questions of all these other people, and inevitably the answer sort of to the death dilemma and how to manage it in the moment was time, building relationships so that you have trust. But I wonder, what is time like in an ICU? Like how do you make that time? Because it seems to me it's incredibly valuable, and in the end might save a lot of time. But you kind of have to front end load it. But how's that work in an ICU that's active and busy?
Yeah, it's not easy, especially with our pressures right now for ICU beds, for our time on service. But you just have to make the commitment. If you see a family member in the room, in the elevator, at Tim Hortons, downstairs in the lobby, whatever, you say hi to them, right? Hi, you're back to visit. Nice to see you again. You just, every time you see them, you pause what you're doing and you walk in. And you can say, I don't have time to chat, but I just wanted to say hello, right? Like, just build that relationship. Give your honest updates, tell them what you're seeing, tell them what you're thinking, and then set some expectations. Say, if my plan works, we'll know by Saturday, right? Like, we should see them feeling better by Saturday. If they can't tolerate a ventilator wean by Saturday, that would tell me X, Y, and Z. And so the family starts to have insight into your own thought processes, and they come along the journey with you. It's not just, I walk in on Saturday and say, well, you know, they failed their vent wean, this isn't going to go well. So it's that process of really showing them what you're thinking and bringing them along with you. And it's tiring, it's exhausting to do that. But if you don't do that, then it's way more work later on, because now you don't have a relationship, you don't have trust, the family's in the dark, they don't know what you're thinking. And then you walk in and try to have a goals of care conversation. You're not going to get the outcome the patient truly deserves from that type of approach.
I'm thinking about, you know, what I've seen is in the absence of those ongoing conversations, in the absence of good information or them knowing like kind of what your plan is, we create content ourselves, right? Our families will create that. And so it's so helpful in terms of eventually being in alignment, you know, in terms of all kind of understanding the point that we're at. It is really important to kind of, as you say, come along throughout that process and not just arrive in a conversation at the end.
Yeah. And so Red said time, relationships, and trust. He didn't say data, right? No one said data, because the data doesn't mean anything useful to anybody who's not in a clinical role. And so I can express data to people and they'll make that what they want it to be, but that's not helpful. The only thing I think that really matters is that when I, with my expertise after 17 years of training, go and make a recommendation to palliate, that the family needs to trust that I'm doing that in the right spirit.
Yeah.
And that's what my conversations, my insight. Families say, oh, he says that their dialysis demands are higher. The family doesn't have to understand that whatsoever, but they know that I'm thinking about kidneys. I'm thinking about how much the machines are working. You know, I give these insights every day to families. You know, here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's the trajectory I hope for. Here's the trajectory I expect. And if we see this trajectory, I'm just telling you right off the bat, that's going to be a really bad sign. And so by the end of it, they've had so much communication that they just believe that I'm a good doctor. And that when I end up making a recommendation, they have the mutual respect. We all respect each other enough to know that I am making this recommendation out of love for your family member.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, every doctor loves every patient that they have. That is what drives us to do what is really a pretty crummy job. You know, not many people, I think, love the lifestyle that they live. When you're up at 4 a.m, resuscitating people, it's tiring work. But the rewarding part comes because we care about the people we provide healthcare to, and we care about their families. And if we can develop that bond with people, then I don't have to sit down and explain what a lactate is. And I don't have to sit down and explain that their EGFR is going to, you know, I can just say it's time now.
Right.
And the majority of the time, the vast majority of the time, that is effective.
Of course, the other thing in the theme in your book too, Blair, is the idea that these conversations it'd be wonderful if families had those ahead of time, right? So we should be talking about that and having those death conversations as part of our experience while we're healthy, so that I mean, it's not that things don't change, they can, but at least having that conversation can assist you in your tasks if the family has already had those talks.
Absolutely. It's so much easier most of the time when a family comes to me and says they would never want this, or, you know, they were very clear. And for people who have multiple comorbidities, that's often very reassuring and reasonable to me. And I can set a scope of care for that person that's in line with their goals of care. But there's sort of another end to that, where if I were to set my goals of care today, and say, oh, I would never want to be on a ventilator, which is something a lot of doctors and nurses have said to me. But then when I'm, 12 years from now, I develop a terrible MSSA pneumonia, I should be put on a ventilator. Like,
right.
if a family came to me and said, oh, mom said she wouldn't want to be on a ventilator, I'd say, fair enough, but like, it's pneumonia. Like a ventilator is the way to go here, which is different from mom has COPD, or mom has end-stage lung cancer, or mom has X, Y, and Z, liver cirrhosis. And then I say, okay, great. Like a ventilator doesn't make sense. But every once in a while, I do get the opposite reaction where people go, oh, they wouldn't want to be in the ICU. And I go, can we talk about that for a second? And I almost feel like I'm betraying my book and all of the people who are so eager for families to have had this conversation. Because every once in a while, I do want to say, well, wait a minute here. This is exactly what my ICU is for. This is what the ventilator was invented for.
And
that's
you're
not
right.
true. The ventilator was invented for polio. But if you have MSSA pneumonia, I can probably get you better.
Right. And that idea of and that's true, I think, for all of us in our work with palliative patients, is the idea of that there are moving targets.
Yes.
And sometimes we have to be willing to adjust those targets. As not just, but I think the conversation around that is really helpful in an early stage part.
And I agree. And it's all about, in the ICU, we use the term time limited trial, which we don't really assign a time limit. Sometimes we make it up 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. I don't know. But this idea that, if things aren't going well, if you're failing on technology, that's a sign that your body is too weak to get over this. And you got to trust the healthcare team to just kind of be honest with themselves and come to that conclusion that, okay, the odds now are not in our favor. And so that's when we go back to the goals of care and say, there's a good chance that if they survive, they'll be 6 months of rehab, they'll be in a nursing home, they'll be tracheostomy dependent. And that's, I can offer my best case scenario at that point. And people say, oh, your best case scenario is not acceptable. And I say, perfect. That's very clear to me. We should stop doing what we're doing.
Yeah. God, I've got so much stuff running through my head. I love your point that data wasn't in my comment, because as you were explaining all of that and that process, what was really front and center was time, relationship, trust, humanity. That it's important for in your process that you see the person not as a patient, but as a human, that the family not as people, wringing their hands, worried, asking questions, but as people, and that you love them. And from a recent stint of a family member in the hospital, that's what pulled them through. They had a doctor that they didn't know they met as a hospitalist, and that person came in and they hung on that visit because they'd take the time and explain what was going on. And that's what turned everything from being, bitter, feeling like you're being left out, oh, I'm being treated, but I don't even know what's wrong or what's happening, to being sort of invited in on the team. People knew what was going on. And it didn't take much, but about maybe, like you said, a cup of coffee or 10 minutes at the bedside. But the shared sense of humanity allowed for trust to develop, and then decisions could get made. And that to me, when you were talking, was so clear. And then the other piece, sorry, I'm just jumping all over this, guys, because I was jumping, that when it comes to that time and you're in that gray zone and it's time to say, maybe the technology isn't working, but there are still more things. That's not necessarily the end of the line. And that's where palliative care comes in, right? And palliative medicine comes in. Medicine doesn't pull back and abandon you. It changes course, and it changes sort of how it provides medicine, but that you're not left. How do families hear that? How does that message get sort of conveyed?
In the ICU, we tend to do our own palliation in people who are going to be relatively imminent. But for a lot of families, they're there with, say, a COPD exacerbation, and it's their third time in hospital, and they hate the BiPAP machine, or, whatever it is. And for those people, early engagement with palliative care is so important because, they fear, well, every time I'm short of breath, I want to come back to the ICU because the mask makes me feel better. And sometimes you just have to say, there's an alternative to the mask where you'll still feel comfortable. You won't feel short of breath. And then they say, oh, and sometimes you just have to say to people, how do you think this is going to end? Like, what do you think happens when you have end-stage COPD or ALS or whatever? And they, oh, I don't know. I just thought we kept coming to the ICU. I go, well, eventually you're going to die from the disease, right? And they go, oh, yeah. Sometimes they haven't even thought about that. So I think having those, maybe not palliative care discussions, but like, hey, like, have you checked in with yourself about what death looks like with this disease? Because like, eventually you're going to die. And I think being in hospital 6 times in a year is a pretty good indication that that's probably coming sooner than you'd like to admit. And sometimes that makes people sort of recalibrate where they're at and be open to a palliative care conversation.
Okay. I like you had a quote in your book. You said, society's forgotten that we have to die.
Yeah. I mean, at some point,
yeah.
Well, I don't know. I don't know, with the amount of technology now, I can literally replace organ by organ. But I mean, at some point, you don't want to live on machines. I mean, I guess some people might, but I think most of us would not find that to be a very fruitful life.
Do you find that people come to your ICU having had those thoughts before, or conversations, or are people just nowhere near that?
Sometimes people have. Sometimes, though, we don't know about it until things hit the fan, and then you kind of have to go to the family, and the family says, oh, we're at that point. Oh, actually, we did talk about this. Or again, just opening it up, like, hey, you're back again. Like, at some point you might choose not to come back, and that's totally fine. Or to also use palliative care in sort of the other regard, and I've brought this theme up a few times of not letting people die too early. But when people say, I don't want that anymore, I say, well, why is that? And maybe palliative care can help with your symptoms so that you can also tolerate medical therapy if you have a goal that supports ongoing medical therapy. You want to make it to a wedding, you want to see someone have a birth, you want to, if you have something to get to and you want to be comfortable to do that, I can blend technology and palliative care together to get you there. But I got to know what you want to get to. This idea of having an open-ended, I just want to live. Okay, well, what do you want to live for? What do you want to live to see? What do you want to live to do? If you can build a construct, I can usually deliver a pretty good plan to get you where you want to be over the next couple of days, weeks, months, but I can't make you live for years when you have multi-organ failure.
So we're talking there about like, how do you want to live? Not just, when people say, well, I want to live, because one of the things you talk about in the book is medicine should be focused, we focus on preventing death rather than saving lives. So that idea of like, how do we want to live? And that's part of those conversations.
Yeah. I mean, your reptilian brain is programmed to eat and fight off tigers and recreate or procreate, pardon me. Like your brain is hardwired over thousands and thousands of years of evolution to not want to die. So it doesn't make sense for me to walk into someone's room and say, hey, you ready to die? Because most people are going to say no, because they're programmed not to want to die. But if I say, look, you're going to die, we have a bit of wiggle room with how you live out the rest of your life. Let's focus on your life. That can help me figure out what people should have done to them in a hospital.
I feel like we have so many more questions, but want to be very respectful of your time. Blair, is there anything we haven't covered? Or, a lot of the people that listen to this podcast, we know are people who are living this time in their life, where they're living with life-threatening illness, or they're a family member supporting someone. And is there something that you wish some of the families that you see would maybe hear earlier on?
Well, I mean, we're scratching the surface here. This is, something that people struggle with if they're in healthcare their entire careers. This is something that families and patients struggle with, sometimes right to the very moment of their death. And I think we've all seen those moments, and we do what we do because we want to prevent them. We don't want people fretting about death while they're experiencing it. We want people to be at peace with their death when the time comes. And we want them to have had the moments that they really want to have leading up to that. Whether that's time to get your affairs in order, whether that's time to feel the sun on your face one more time, whether that's time to have a shot of whiskey or eat some chocolate cake, like whatever it is, I can probably do that for you if you're at peace with dying. But if you're not at peace with dying, then, it's like this just like miserable minute by minute existence until that moment comes. And I don't want that for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And when we make that, flip of the switch to realize that death is coming, is very hard to say. But at some point, everyone knows, right? Maybe later than we ought to, but we get to that point where we're like, okay, I don't have the science, I don't have the machines, I don't have the drugs necessary to meet your goals long term. And so you're going to die. What do you want that to look like? Because you can have some of your best moments in life on the last day of it, but only if you're accepting.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a beautiful note. And I know that that's why the three of us are working in this area too, because we see that what you're feeling and what you're speaking of, we also get to witness that.
Yeah, absolutely. People say, oh, it must be great to have a job where you save lives. But on the days that I save people's lives, like those days were hard for people and they weren't fun, but we got them through it. But one of the biggest privileges I have is on the days where people die, when they die in a way that is amazingly beautiful and meaningful, because that could be the best day of that person's life. And we've all seen people have, families come together, moments are created, there's laughter, death can be very, very beautiful. But our technology can really be disruptive of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry, Julie. I'm looking at Julie. Think she's probably going to pull the plug here on it. But anyway, try to wrap it up. But you said that so wonderfully in your book. Just that you encapsulated this conversation. When both sides come to the table carrying their responsibility, you said, when ICU doctors love their patients and understand their families, and when families understand the limitations of medicine at the end of life, we can form an alliance to honor a person's life with a loving end. I thought that was quite eloquently said, and you said it in your own words again here today. But boy, does it bear repeating.
Yeah. No, the quote's better, so we should end on that.
Thank you, Blair, so much.
Thank you.
It's what you do, but it's how you do it, right? Just the place that we're ending here, and I love that we've had a conversation today that while we're talking about medicine, we're also talking about love, and that we're talking about families and humanity. And so thank you so much for bringing this book into the world for that is causing people to have these kind of conversations, and for having this conversation with us today. Like, my heartfelt appreciation, gratitude for that.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege to chat with all of you today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blair.
Thanks, Blair.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage. Technical support provided by Sean and Jonah Heikert. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio. You can find more episodes for free on most major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Castbox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It really makes a difference.